Welcome. My name is Alfredo Estrada. I'm the editor and publisher of Hispanic Magazine. It's truly a privilege for me to welcome you all to the forum event at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. A Nation of Immigrants, Benefit or Burden. It's sponsored by a number of different groups here, and I'd like to mention just a few of them in terms of the recognition. My particular thanks to the Dean's Office and Dean Carnesal, and particularly the Harvard Journal of Hispanic Policy, the Latino Student Caucus, the Asian American Policy Review, the Asian Student Caucus, and the Harvard Journal of African American Policy, and the Black Caucus. Immigration is truly a hot issue. Immigration is something that we all talk about, that we read in the papers, that we see on CNN. The discussion often takes very extreme points of view. There are too many immigrants. There aren't enough immigrants. We should stop the flow of immigrants. We should deport those immigrants. Immigrants help this country. Immigrants hurt this country. As you can see, we'll attempt to resolve or at least discuss in an objective fashion some of those issues here tonight. I think one point that's very important to make is the discussion about immigration is not simply a political issue. It's an issue that affects all Americans. The debate over immigration is quite simply the debate over the future of America and what country America is and what country America will be. So that the discussion is actually quite important to all of us. The current issue of Hispanic Magazine, and you'll see some of the issues that we've distributed, I think make the point that immigration affects Hispanics uniquely. And I'd like to bring out a couple of points in that article I think are relevant to this discussion to sort of set the tone. A couple of incidents that have happened recently, and I think many of you here in the audience will appreciate this. A few months ago, a 20-year-old college kid in Santa Barbara, California, a very affluent community, is outside his home painting his parents' house. Some INS agents come by, ask him if he can produce his birth certificate. He could not, and he was deported to Tijuana. A similar type of situation, the mayor of the small town of Pomona, apart from being mayor, he also ran an automotive parts business. One Saturday afternoon, he's out in his truck picking up some parts for his business. Again, some INS agents stopped him, informed him that he fit the profile of the illegal immigrant, and were about to deport him until he actually pulled out his wallet with the mayor's badge. These types of things are happening, and they affect Hispanics profoundly. But ironically, according to some very recent polls, the Latino Political Survey 1992, up to 84% of all Hispanics in this country say there are too many immigrants. So it truly is an issue that is far from being resolved. Certainly among the non-Hispanic population, many people feel there are too many immigrants. 1993, an LA Times survey showed that 70% of Californians have a hard time distinguishing between legal and illegal immigrants. Of course, it's difficult to say why legal immigrants look different from illegal immigrants, but I think the point is well taken. Often it's posited in economic terms. Do immigrants contribute more to the economy than they take out? Do they take away jobs? Do they add jobs? Those are some of the issues we'll be discussing tonight. We have a very distinguished panel. And I'll introduce them all in turn. The format for tonight is quite simple. Each of the panelists will speak briefly. Paul Carota, whom I'll introduce in a second, will show us a film of some very interesting work of his. And then following that, we'll have an opportunity for questions from the audience. At that point, we'll have done enough talking. We want to hear from you. We want to hear what you think about what we've said, what issues are important to you, and how best we can move on towards some clearer definition of these issues. And let me stress, at that point, it really is your show, so we do look forward to some comments on your part. Mr. Paul Kuroda is currently the Director of Photography at the Daily Breeze in Torrance, California. He worked for 3 California newspapers, the Clovis Independent and Tribune, the Fresno Bee, and the Orange County Register. In 1992, he was a finalist in the Pulitzer Prize for Story on Immigration, and that's the subject of the film that you'll be seeing this evening. In 1991, Mr. Kuroda was named the National Press Photographer Association Newspaper Photographer of the Year. This is the most coveted recognition in newspaper journalism today. My privilege to introduce Mr. Paul Kuroda.
Thank you, Alfredo. Is this working okay, Stephen? Oh, great, it works. Okay. I would like to thank Mary Lou Fulton for inviting me here, first of all, and the Harvard Journal of Hispanic Policy. I'm from California. It's really cold here, I notice, even though the sun is out. But you know, in California, we have seasons too. We have 4 seasons. It's fire, mudslide, earthquake, and smog. And the trees does change colors. But it depends on what gang of taggers are painting them. I kind of want to tell you about myself. I'm from Fresno, a small Japanese-American, second generation, because my mom is actually from Tokyo. My father is a Nisei, second generation, and I'm third, I guess, technically, because I came and speak Japanese. But you know, he was incarcerated during the war because he's Japanese-American, but he managed to get out and work on a farm where I grew up. On this farm, I grew close to the workers, the laborers, so to speak, the help. The help were vital to our farm, and they're all Mexican. They're all Mexican. And my father spoke fluent Spanish. It was really neat to hear him just talk to them like that. And one time, our pet dog came over and for some reason wanted to attack me. So it was attacking me, and I just looking at the dog and to see the 4 legs and the dog. I don't know why it was. But then Alejandro came by and he saved me. So I really touched and exposed to immigrant labor in California right off the bat. I married a Mexican immigrant from La Mira, Michoacan, and she took me back to her old village. It's a tiny little village in La Mira, and it's incredible. There's, you know, they just, like, the big family just lives in one room. There's no plumbing whatsoever. You can't even have fresh water. It was incredible. And they're just striving, trying to make it. And they have all these children, and children are working too. And it's hard. It's very difficult. And through the years, we received one night, in the middle of the night, we received a phone call. And it was Jorge, my ex-wife's brother. And he needed for us to pay off the coyote, the smuggler, down in LA. So we got in the car in Fresno and drove and picked him up, paid off the coyote, $300, and brought him back to Fresno all in one night. And he worked and worked and worked and sent money back to the family. And we tried to, but you know, we only could afford so much. Henceforth, this story. Working for the Orange County Register, all of a sudden we had to do an immigration story. So I volunteered. Well, they actually assigned me, and that was perfect for me, because this is one story that I wanted to tell. One story where I could see there's a struggle, a modern-day struggle of humanity coming up, crossing that line, becoming illegal because they crossed this line, and making it, trying to make it, you know, living in really dilapidated working conditions. So I got it. So I got the assignment, and I crossed the border. I went over to the border with an assistant who spoke fluent Spanish. And I wanted him to kind of watch my backside, because as you know, the border is full of banditos and some corrupt border agents, et cetera, et cetera. So we went out there, we caught up we met a family. First of all, how dark it was. I couldn't even see the ground. It was that black. It was incredibly black. I had infrared film because that's the only way I could shoot in those conditions. The family, one member was raped. Just 7 days earlier, they were robbed. And here they are, making the crossing again. We went out when everyone moved at a moment during a shift change of the border agents. We went out, and this is just north of Tijuana, a 14-mile area where maybe like 90% of all illegal immigration comes in this area. It's amazing. Of a 2,000-mile border, maybe 14 miles is where most of the crossings are made. So we went through there. We hid in the bush when the coyote said, "Get under, jump, get under, and be quiet." the babies were quiet. I couldn't believe it. The babies were quiet. They just sensed it. The Amiga was coming up, and I didn't make a sound. I went under a bush, and I didn't even move. And all of a sudden, bam, 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 there was a helicopter just coming. You know, it was horrendous, this huge, prodigious noise, and all of a sudden the blackness was turned to light, just like this. All this light coming down. And I just wanted to run. I just had this primate urge just to scale and run. Thoughts came over my head of how we have now, the border agents have cases against some agents who are shooting immigrants who fled from their, disobeying their command. They shot them in the back. There's cases like that out. But anyway, those thoughts just came, but I just wanted to run. I didn't care what it was. I just, you know, when you're threatened like that, you just become like a prey. I also crossed the Black River. You'll see pictures in my presentation of this horrid river. And it's pitch black. It's La Negra River, and it's just the raw sewage and chemicals from factories. So you'll see also reflection in the lens because I fell in there. I didn't get a good grip and kind of went in. And I managed to get some pictures afterwards, but the agents are told whenever they step into that water, they have to get shots and everything because it's really ugly stuff. And then you're going to see some pictures of the real dangerous crossing, the San Clemente checkpoint. It's where many people are getting killed because they're trying to avoid this checkpoint. It was 70 miles north of the border, actual border. And the smugglers let off their people, the pollos, they call them, the clients, before the checkpoint, if the checkpoint is open, and then the clients run across the 8 lanes of fast-moving freeway, and then run past the checkpoint on the opposite side northbound, and then cross over again. They cross it twice. Many of them are part of small villages. They don't really know how fast these cars can go, and they get hit. We followed 2 victims back, and they were just coming up just to visit their sons in Santa Ana, California. But they just couldn't get legally by the line for this visit, so they made the crossing illegally, and they were unfortunate. They died together. Following the body back to the small village, there was a funeral that went for 3 days. It was one of the hardest things I ever photographed in my life. One of the stark pictures I see that I didn't take was while we were crowded in next to the coffin, this little girl who was one of the grandchildren just looked up, and her face just wrought with tears and pain, and I couldn't take a picture, but it was incredible. And the thing is, I was thinking, a little girl should not cry like this. It was senseless to me, because if you notice, there are border crossing, there's human crossing signs. You see it in the show. It's almost like deer crossing signs, and you just wonder why is all this happening. The first part of this presentation is on Vietnamese gangs. Is part of the package I put together here. And it's a new immigrant ethnic group here in the United States. Only a small fraction of this large growing immigration ethnic group here in the US. So I just wanted to kind of show what the gangs were all about, because I felt that the media basically covers it in statistics and crime reports, etc. But I wanted to show there are love, and there are reasons, real reasons why people gather to find true love. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Our next panelist, Congressman Javier Becerra, was elected in November 1992 to represent California's new 30th Congressional District, located in the city of Los Angeles. He earned his Bachelor of Arts degree in economics in 1980 from Stanford University, where he also received his law degree in 1984. He began his legal career working in a legal services office representing the mentally ill, went on to run the Los Angeles District Office of State Senator Art Torres, prior to becoming the Deputy Attorney General with the California Department of Justice. Prior to his election to Congress, Mr. Becerra served one term in the California Assembly as representative of the 59th Assembly District. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Javier Becerra.
Thank you and good evening. Let me first thank the Policy Institute and all of you who are here today for inviting me and the other respected and distinguished members of the panel. I'm glad that you can travel to Boston, Cambridge, any part of this nation now, and you can discuss the issue of immigration and hopefully find it will be a reasoned debate on the issue of immigration. But before I launch into my words to you today, let me perhaps share with you some words that we all probably know very, very well but often forget. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. All persons born in the United States are citizens of the United States. No state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Whether it's the Declaration of Independence, Emma Lazarus and America's Statue of Liberty, or the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution, these are words we respect in speech, but words we often neglect in practice. Take, for example, the immigrant. America's newcomers work long hours for indecent wages. They nourish families and religious values at a time when things are evaporating like that in America. They pay the same taxes that citizens pay while utilizing government assistance at much lower rates, if at all. They do all of this, and yet they find the finger pointed at them when this country has a recession, when we find our schools decaying, when we find increasing crime, and of course when we find we have a crisis in our health and welfare systems. As Rodney King would say, I get no respect. Well, I would tell Rodney King, move over, because you get much more respect than do immigrants. But then again, immigrants have always been the beast of burden in America. The involuntary immigration of Africans represents this country's most tortured and compelling case history of that. You can talk about the Irish, the Jews, the Poles, the Italians, the folks that laid the bricks that built the big eastern cities. You can talk about the Asian, Latino immigrants who built the tracks that brought those eastern cities to the pioneering West. And when the West needed more labor, it turned to immigrants again. Today, the accomplishments of our immigrant mothers and our immigrant brothers are overshadowed, however, by high-tech 20-second soundbite politics. California's Governor Pete Wilson blames a $2 billion state budget deficit on undocumented immigrants. He forgets to mention that the state has lost nearly 800,000 jobs during his tenure, 200,000 in the aerospace industry alone. Immigrants didn't take jobs in the aerospace industry. He also forgets to mention that California's immigrants did not sit in any of the boardrooms of the savings and loans institutions which squandered $24 billion at the expense of California depositors. That's just California. That will cost California taxpayers, not the folks in Massachusetts, not anywhere else in the nation. California's taxpayers about $1,000 apiece to bail out the savings and loans institutions just in California. Governor Wilson and other state leaders these days fail to mention that immigrants pay the same sales taxes, the same property and business taxes that each and every citizen in that state pays. Their paychecks reflect the same deductions as ours, yet the immigrant worker who pays into unemployment, who pays into welfare, does not get to collect because he or she is undocumented. The immigrant story, however, is not filled with those, as you saw today by Mr. Kuroda. Too often, the story of the immigrant is sculpted by the politician and not the statistician. Most refugees and immigrants, it should be told, enter the United States legally. 8 out of perhaps 10 to 11 enter this country completely legally. The United States, it must be told, has a rational legal admissions policy which is based on the values of family, freedom, and work. More than 60% of all the immigrants who enter into this country do so because they are trying to reunite with family members. The others, it's because of political persecution that they come to this country, or because this country wants them because we cannot find the skills that they have and possess for the labor workforce that we need here in this country. Contrary to the myth, immigrants, like their predecessors, are newcomers that are integrating rapidly, and very successfully, I might say, into the American society. 30% of immigrants marry outside their own ethnic group. Virtually all the children of immigrants not only speak English fluently, but actually prefer to speak that language than their own native tongue. Immigrant children, by the way, have ambitions. 4/5 expect to complete college, and 70% aspire to professional or business careers. And most importantly, on the economic front, and contrary to all the speeches that you're hearing these days, the impact of our newcomers is decidedly positive. In a recent survey, top economists were asked to assess the overall effect of immigration on the nation's economic growth. 81% said, quote, very favorable, and the other 19% answered slightly favorable. Immigrants help the economy, and it makes sense. Think about it. Most arrive when they're very young, they're healthy, most are hardworking, and many open businesses. As a result, relatively few rely on public assistance programs, and they don't utilize the programs that are utilized by, for example, our elderly, our poor, or our disabled. But what we have to recognize is what goes into the federal treasury as a result of the immigrant tax dollar doesn't always benefit the communities that are home to these particular immigrants. The majority of refugees and immigrants settle in certain states and cities. I think that becomes very obvious. Los Angeles, of course, is the prime example. More than half of all newcomers settle in places like Los Angeles and New York City. But they don't get back the dollars that these immigrants contribute. As a result, the short-term costs related to education and health care are borne disproportionately by areas like Los Angeles and New York City. But the failure of Washington to enact cogent immigration policy should not doom immigrants to the firing squad. We have to do what the good physician has always taught us to do. Treat the cause, don't treat the symptom. Let me mention to you what I think we should be doing, and 4 quick points. First, we should recognize one very fundamental principle. The right of citizenship by birth and through naturalization underlies the greatness of our nation. Just take a look at the Declaration of Independence. Take a look at the 14th Amendment. Second, as a sovereign nation, the U.S. has every right and a duty, in fact, to effectively regulate its borders. Third, human dignity and respect are cornerstones of American democracy and tradition. All immigrants, including the undocumented, have basic human and civil rights. And finally, and perhaps the most important, the truest means of reducing undocumented immigration involves raising the standard of living and improving life opportunities in the countries that are sending us the immigrants. Immigration reform will take time and some money, but we should avoid those types of policies that would threaten civil rights, that would undermine our Constitution, and that would threaten the well-being of people who are elderly, disabled, or poor. There is no reason to trample on the rights and opportunities of hard-working Americans, whether they've been here 3 generations or 3 years. It only does more to undermine national values and unity and progress. I believe we must improve the effectiveness of the Border Patrol. We must provide them with more resources. We have to provide them with better training. We have to improve their hiring standards so they don't hire people who have criminal records. And we must make sure that we're not allowing them to abuse the people they're there to apprehend. Let's also get tough on the smuggling rings that deprive people of their freedom, and they make them pay money at the same time. Let's make sure we're taking care of visa fraud. Let's make sure we're taking care of asylum fraud, so those who are coming into the country with valid claims are able to be processed through. And then, of course, let's make sure we're developing foreign policies and developmental policies throughout the world which will encourage nations to build their infrastructure so we don't have to worry about them sending people to our country because they can't afford to create the jobs that are needed there at home. But perhaps sooner or later, the most important thing will hit us here and, more importantly, in Washington, D.C., and that is the need for a cogent federal policy which will provide monies to those areas that are disproportionately impacted by immigrants at the local level. Until we do that, what we will find is that there will be no peace, because those local cities and counties and states will declare war on Washington until Washington begins to reimburse those states with immigrant tax dollars based on the fact that these are immigrants who are working. Over the years, I think it's fair to say that immigrants have been those who have endured insult, they've endured accusation, they've endured oceans, they've endured mountains, they've endured poverty, persecution, and today the assault is politics. But when you've crossed oceans and you've climbed mountains, no fence, no ditch will stop you, and no politic will stop you. Because as you saw in the film, what drives people here is humanity. It's an attempt to do better for yourself and your children that you were able to get along with in your existence. And that won't change. Whether Governor Pete Wilson wants it to change or not, it won't change unless he does it the right way. We are right now undergoing a debate in Washington, D.C., which does nothing about trying to deal with the issues of immigration. I hope we will find that by the end of this year, we will come up with some cogent policy which will deal with immigration and will deal with immigrants and separate the two. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to introduce our next panelist, who incidentally was featured on the cover of Hispanic Magazine a couple of years ago. Antonia Hernandez is the President and General Counsel of MALDEF, the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, a national advocacy organization that uses the law, community education, and research to protect the civil rights of the nation's Hispanic community. Ms. Hernandez earned her BA at UCLA and her JD at the UCLA School of Law. She began a professional legal career as a staff attorney with the Los Angeles Center for Law and Justice, and later served on the Senate Committee for the Judiciary, chaired by Senator Kennedy. An expert in civil rights and immigration issues, she's received a number of different awards, including the Águila Azteca, presented by the Mexican government, the Hubert H. Humphrey Award, the UCLA Alumnus of the Year Award, and the UCLA Law School established the Antonia Hernandez Public Service Award for its graduates. Please join me in welcoming Antonia Hernandez.
Good evening, buenas noches to all of you. And I am indeed pleased to be here with you to discuss with you, hopefully in a rational manner, an extremely emotional issue. Immigration, like language, is one of those issues in the history of America that tugs at the inner ends of your tummy. There are no neutral positions on immigration, and unfortunately, throughout the history of this country, a lot of the debate is emotional. But what I want to do today is something rather simplistic. I, as an immigrant, for better or for worse, throughout my career, have been tagged as the person that should be involved in immigration. And I guess we're all victims of our stereotypes, and I've tried to make the best of it. But what I want to do today is really provide you with some facts and statistics that will give you a foundation to truly discuss immigration in a rational manner. And sometimes we get into the debate without really knowing. As you all know, we're in the middle of an anti-immigrant mood in this country. And yet when you speak with most people and you tell them, tell me what it is about the immigration and what the problem is or what concerns you have, they don't know. So let me tell you what our immigration policy is in this country, and so we can try to determine where the problem is. Immigration is really dealing with three issues. You deal with the asylum issue. It's a political decision that's made every year by the State Department. On the average for the last 8 to 10 years, it's about 100 to 150,000 individuals that are allowed to come into this country as asylees, as refugees. In 1980, Congress passed a law expanding the definition of what a refugee is. But for all intents and purposes, up to 3 years ago, if you came from a communist country, if you came fleeing from Argentina, that wasn't good enough. If you came from Cuba, it was. If you came from Poland, it was okay. Of course, if you came from Russia, it was okay. If you came from El Salvador or Nicaragua, it wasn't okay. It is strictly a political decision. Those refugees that come into our country under the refugee do get assistance for a period of time. Those are the only immigrants that received assistance while establishing themselves in our country. The large portion of immigrants that come into this country legally come through our immigration laws. And up to 1986 and 1991, 92, the last time we had major changes in our immigration policy was in 1965. Our immigration laws are rather simplistic. And every country from every part of the world has the same quota. And you have to fall within the 6 or 7 categories. The majority of the categories are family reunification. If you are a spouse, a child of a United States citizen, if you're the parent of a United States citizen, you can come in outside the quota, as it is called. There's a great deal of debate of whether we're receiving too many legal immigrants or too few. And when you hear about Congress talking about redoing, tinkering with the immigration laws, you're talking about legal immigration. And then there's illegal migration. And illegal migration has been going on in this country since it began, with the original pilgrims being undocumented. They didn't have documents. It is not a new phenomenon. The other thing to consider is that they come in not just by land, not just through the southern border, they come through Canada. JFK and the airports, Miami, Los Angeles, is another source of illegal migration. A large and significant part of the illegal migration comes through student visas or tourist visas, and they overstay their visa and remain in this country. And those individuals are harder to spot. They're the ones that came in with some economic means, and they're hard to filter out. It's hard to figure out in a Denver suburb whether you're from Canada or not. But you ask an immigration officer what an undocumented looks like, and he'll define to you a person looks just like me, only not dressed like me. And that is the problem that we have. Now, I will tell you that in my 23 years of involvement in this issue, I want to state some facts unequivocally on the table. And they're basically the 4 fundamental principles that Congressman Becerra stated earlier, in which I think that we need to discuss immigration policy. And a group in California, calling itself Pride, sort of has adopted these basic principles that we're asking political elected officials involved in an immigration debate to adhere to. We have asked Governor Wilson and all of those people running for office who find immigration the appropriate issue to discuss today. The 4 principles are very, very simple. One of them is that birth in the United States entitles you to citizenship. It is the foundation of what this country was founded on. And any attempts to change that, you folks who are here at Harvard must think of what that will do to the foundations and the principles of this country. Because it will not only affect the child born here of undocumented parents, but it will affect what this country is all about. And if you read your history right, you know, we forgot our economic standings. We forgot nobility when we came to this land, and we all started new. The other issue, of course, is an effort by this country, which has never taken place, that the Immigration and Naturalization Service should mount a massive effort to naturalize the millions of legal residents who are not naturalized. And if you think about naturalization, it is not just a process. It is a means of assimilating those immigrants into our society. The second principle is that notwithstanding the fact that an individual is undocumented, illegal, that all human beings have basic human rights, and that the 2 fundamental benefits, if you want to call them, that cannot be taken away is, if you're a child, a K through 12 education. And it's not just being noble, it's being smart. Because those undocumented are not going to go back. They're going to be in our midst, and it's better to have educated individuals than uneducated. The other fundamental is that there should not be denial of emergency and public health benefits to individuals within our shores. Once again, it's really a public health issue. You don't want people walking around without the benefit of immunization and of critical medical assistance. The third principle is we recognize that this country is a sovereign country, that it should be entitled to protect its borders. We do not quibble with that. But what we say is that it must be civilian border enforcement, that it cannot be militarized. It cannot be a Berlin Wall. And I want you folks to really keep something in mind. People used to climb the Berlin Wall to get out. People are dying to come into this country. It should be something that we should be proud of. The final one is that we have to treat migration at its source, and that economic development and that the foreign policy statements and positions that we take have an effect on migration. About 5 to 10 years ago, there was a great many Nicaraguans coming to this country illegally. That flow came and slowed to a trickle after the situation in Nicaragua stabilized. And in fact, many Nicaraguans returned. The instability in El Salvador is creating that push to come to this country. And so we people involved in public policy must never divorce what the State Department is doing with what impact it will have on people. Now, what is going on in California and in the rest of this country? We recently participated in a press conference, and to dramatize our position, I had my staff go and research. And we took the front page of the LA Times for 1917, 1924, 1954, and 1994. And we could have easily traded one for the other. There are some ugly things going on. And unfortunately, political demagogues have opened up the genie bottle. And a lot of the ugliness in some human beings have been lashed out. And I will leave you with this final thought. About a month and a half ago, we received a copy of a flyer that was being disseminated in Orange County, California. And it had the ugly caricature of a Mexican pregnant woman with a tattoo. And inside that pregnant woman was an embryo, a fetus. And then the quote said, "We know why Mexicans breed, because they're already born pregnant. Kill a Mexican," and it gave you a phone number. It is things like these that are going on that we need to control. That is not to say that we cannot debate. I am here to debate numbers. I am here to debate how our immigration policy should be handled. But what we need to remember is that within our country, throughout history, this country has engaged in conduct that we have been ashamed of. And I hope that as we debate this issue, that it's not a Mexican issue. If you look into this country, we have the largest communities of every country in the world. And they're all looking for the same thing. We get the most motivated, the most creative, the most entrepreneurial. And the issue before us is, how do we control the flow? Now, how we stop the flow, that will never happen. How do we control the flow so that we benefit the individuals coming and our society? And in that regard, I hope that this debate will be the beginning of that discussion so that we can enlighten the folks out there and hopefully come up with some relevant, cogent immigration policy. Thank you.
Our next panelist, Musafareh Chisti, is a lawyer and director of the Immigration Project of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, which provides immigration legal services to members of the union through its offices in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. He was educated at St. Stephen's College, Delhi, the University of Delhi, Cornell Law School, and the Columbia School of International Affairs. He's currently chairman of the board of directors of the National Immigration Forum, secretary of the National Coalition for Haitian Refugees, and a member of the Coordinating Committee on Immigration of the American Bar Association. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Musafareh Chisti.
Thank you, folks, and good evening. And it really is a pleasure to be at the Kennedy School for this forum. And as those of you who have heard Antonia in the past, it's always almost suicidal to follow her at any panel discussion. But given the fact that we have to engage in various masochistic and seductive activities and immigration debate all the time, we do it still. You've heard that immigration is hard not to be an emotional subject, and you've seen enough evidence of that today. What I want to point out is that in the immigration debate in the entire Western world, we are today at an extremely important, critical venture. In the debate in Western Europe, we have concluded, essentially, the European democracies have concluded that immigration should be seen as equal to national security issue, and that immigration should be fully stopped. We are not that close to that in the United States, but we're getting precariously close to the position when immigration will be seen as an important threat in the context. And I think that's why the debate on immigration is no longer confined to issues of undocumented immigration, to issues of costs and benefits, but to the very definition of what is threatening the national polity. Debate on illegal immigration, or immigration in general, has always been an anxiety-creating debate. But I would suggest in the last 2 years, the high-profile issues like the bombing of the World Trade Center, like the killings of some 2 CIA officials outside DC, and some of the invective that was generated in the presidential debate has brought immigration to a new point of invective. And the generalized anxiety about immigration today is that we're having too many people come in and too many wrong kind of people come in. Debate on immigration today, as it has been, and Antonio pointed it out very well successfully, is always framed in a mixture of fact, mixture of fear, mixture of myth, and increasingly a tinge of politics. First, facts. Facts do dictate a good part of the framing of the debate. In the 1980s, we admitted about 8 million people to the United States as immigrants. That's about net of 1 million a year. That is the highest we have received since the two first decades of the 20th century. That's a fact. 3/4 of the immigrants that come to this country come from 10 countries of the world. That's a fact. About 3/4 of the immigrants who come to the country settle in about 6 states of the country. That's a fact. About 90% of immigrants who came to the country in 1965 were European. Today, 90% of immigrants who come to the country are not European. They are Asian and they are Hispanic. Therefore, it's easy to say when the complexion of the migration stream changes, fear in the body politic takes on a very palpable edge to it. But there are also myths, and extremely important to be able to distinguish facts from myths. And the mix, to put it in a very quick summary, is framed in about 5 major concerns. A, that immigration is out of control, and 2, that new immigrants are depressing wages and working conditions of US workers. 3, the new immigrants have a strong reliance on welfare and are a drain on our social services. And 4th, I would suggest that new immigrants are difficult to assimilate. They are a different breed than the pre-1965 immigrants. Luckily, there is an impressive body of literature and studies which do belie all these myths, and it's obviously we don't have the time to talk about all the myths that I mentioned. From my perspective of the union, let me only talk about 2 or 3. First, whether immigration is out of control or no. We only take about 1 million immigrants a year. If you look at the total population of this country, that is still significantly less than the population or the proportion population of the French, the German, the Australians, and the Canadians. Despite our feeling of ourselves as being a country of immigrants, those 4 countries, as a percentage of their population, take more immigrants than we do. When you talk about illegal immigration, best statistics on this issue will tell you that we probably have at any particular time not more than 3.5 million undocumented immigrants in the country. Suggests that's a large number, but given the total population of the country, it is not an indication of a system out of control. On the issue of jobs, first of all, I think it really is a tragic framing of policy of seeing jobs of immigrants only as consumers of jobs. Immigrants come in and they create jobs. Our union is a very good example of that. We represent garment workers all across the country, and the garment workers in the last 15 or 17 years in New York have been increasingly Asian. We have 20,000 Chinese American workers working in the apparel industry in New York. There were 5 Chinese American shops in New York's Chinatown in 1959. There are 500 Chinese American owned shops in New York, operated, financed, run by people who came to this country only in the last 15 or 17 years. I would suggest that is not an evidence of displacement of American workers. That is clearly an evidence of having created jobs in the country by the stream of immigrants. Second, I think on the job front, the argument that I find particularly disregarded is how immigrants have been America's, what I think the Business Week actually recently called them as our urban boosters. If you look at what's happened to the major metropolises of the country, in the last 10 years or so, the population of the 10 largest cities of the United States rose by about 4.7%. And I think demographers will tell you that if they hadn't been for immigrants coming into those cities, the numbers of those cities would have gone down about 8 to 10%. In New York City, which I know a little more about, that if you look at the out-migration of people from New York City, we would not have the kind of level of population that we have in New York City without the immigrants coming in and changing our neighborhoods and our niches of our economy, obviously, for the better. And I think just 2 points on reliance on welfare and other social support systems. Immigrants don't come here for the quality of air in New York City, and they certainly don't come to attract for a welfare check. If they wanted to rely on that, they would have stayed home. People come because they want to work, and they increasingly come in the younger and productive years of your life. Only about the Social Security system, because we do frequently get focused on the contribution of immigrants. I think there have been many studies which would show that if we keep on admitting about 1 million immigrants a year, which is the level we have today, the level of contribution in purely Social Security income, Social Security contributions is about $70 billion. And these are immigrants who will never see their parents derive the benefit of the contribution that they made to our Social Security system. It will be essentially the parents of the native-born US workers who will be the beneficiaries of this contribution. And last, quickly, a word about assimilation. I happen to believe that education is key to assimilation. If you look at the streams of population in the last 10 years of immigrants, about 24% of immigrants who come to the United States have 4 or more years of college education. If you look at the comparable figures of the US population, it's about 16%. You would actually say that we are getting a much higher percentage of the educated people coming to this country, which obviously has an interesting effect in the labor market. I don't have to tell you, many of you have had friends who will be Westinghouse finalists and valedictorians. About 60% of the scholarships that Westinghouse offers every year go to immigrants. Many of them actually go to the children of our Chinese American members who have been, I would suggest to you, in this country less than 15 years, chasing the American dream as everyone in the generations prior to that. And I think since we are at a panel which has been sponsored by many of the Hispanic student groups, there is a much more attention on the issue of assimilation with respect to the Hispanics, and I think unfairly so. That people are saying Hispanics in particular are not prone to assimilation. 75% of Hispanic Americans speak English on a regular basis in about 15 years after they have come to the United States. I would suggest to you that if anyone looked at the prior waves of immigration before 1965 of the European stock and other stock, it took them probably longer to be able to be comfortable in English in the same generation. Assimilation, by its very definition, is a generational phenomenon. If people are coming in today, by the next generation, they will sound and behave like every other wave of immigrants that we have seen. Therefore, conclude, I would say that people may be coming to this country speaking different languages, and they certainly are coming with different skin colors. But today's immigrants are clearly tomorrow's America's middle class, and today's seekers of the American dream are clearly defenders of tomorrow's American dream. We do have, to the point I started on, in the juncture on public policy on immigration today, we can follow the European example and shut the door, or we can follow the American example and keep the consensus on immigration as we did in our history. As an immigrant, I would tell you that I recommend that we follow the American door and not the European one. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our final panelist, Mr. Peter Brimlow, is currently the senior editor at Forbes magazine as well as at the National Review. He was educated at the University of Sussex and received his MBA at Stanford. He's worked for a number of publications throughout his career, including Fortune, Barron's, the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, and he's currently working on a book due out next year by Random House called Electing a New People, Common Sense About Immigration. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Peter Brimlow.
Thank you, Alfredo. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank also the Journal of Hispanic Policy and the other organizations for inviting me here. I think I'm going to be the only person in the room who's in favor of some sort of restriction on immigration, probably the only person in Cambridge, possibly the only person in Massachusetts, but not the only person in the US. And I'd like to thank the Dean's Office for financing my trip up here. They did so on condition I be controversial, and they've not, I have to get my return ticket from them, so I have to be controversial here. I do want to say, particularly as this is being taped, that the views I'm about to enunciate are absolutely not those of my employer at Forbes. In fact, he takes exactly the opposite standpoint. Steve Forbes, Malcolm Forbes III. He has a very serious servant problem in his estate in Far Hills. And so he obviously needs... actually, I'm not joking about this. I mean, there's a real class issue with immigration. Typically, the middle classes, the upper middle classes, they see immigrants as people who serve them behind the counter in all these marvelous Korean delis we have in New York. What time do you want me to stop, by the way? Are we behind time? Okay. It's the unskilled immigrant, the unskilled native-born Americans, the blue-collar workers, who get it in the ear. And that means particularly because they face competition from what is predominantly heavily now an unskilled inflow. And that means, in this country, that means above all the blacks. And this is the third time it's happened in the last 200 years to the blacks. First of all, they were displaced from their jobs in New York City. A lot of them in the 1830s were maids and so on, and worked in servants in New York. They were displaced by the Irish. Then, after the Civil War, there was some evidence that they were penetrating the industrial North. They were displaced by the great wave of immigration that came in the 1880s and the 1890s. And now, since 1965, nobody has made the connection, but we see, I don't know how many of you read Andrew Hacker's book, pathologies of the most extreme type taking over in the black community. They're not, substantial numbers of them are not making significant advances. Now, Alfredo mentioned my book a few months ago, which is provisionally titled Electing a New People. And this brings me to the only practical piece of information that I have to, or of advice that I have to convey to you here. Many of you will be writing books at some point in your life. I'm here to tell you, you must never take the advice of the publisher on the title. I've done this is the third book I've written. This is why I say it's provisionally titled, because we have to have a confrontation about this. They're always wrong. They always tell you they know what's going to sell and so on, and they never do. Nobody knows why people buy books. And this is important because you may think, well, you're only slightly irritated by it. But by the time you've repeated it 1,000 times on the talk show circuit, this slight irritation becomes a great festering sore, and I'm never going to make that mistake again, and I recommend that you don't make it either. Electing a new people comes from a poem by Bertolt Brecht. In 1953, there was a riot against the communist government in East Germany, and Brecht wrote a poem. This is obviously very shocking to the communist government because it thought it represented the proletariat. Excuse me. I wonder if you could pass me some water there. Right at the end. Thanks. They thought it represented the proletariat, and here were the proletariat in rebellion against them. Brecht wrote a poem which he said the government should dissolve the people and elect a new one. I like this because that's actually what's happening in the US. The government has decided by public policy, and it's entirely through public policy, thanks very much, to dissolve the people and elect a new one. If it wasn't for immigration, the US population would probably stabilize in the early years of the next century. Because at current immigration levels, it will go up to stabilize at maybe 250 million, something like that, 260, 70 million. Because of immigration, it will go up to 380 million. A third of the population in the US in 2050 will be immigrants, post-1970 immigrants and their descendants. That kind of growth, incidentally, is unprecedented in the industrial world. Most industrial countries are going to stabilize. And that 2050 is also interesting because that's the point at which the white population slips below 50%, somewhere around there. And this has all been done by public policy. It's done because the government wants it to happen. I mean, at least apparently wants it to happen. I mean, that's what immigration policy is organized to achieve. There's never been as radical or as rapid an ethnic and demographic shift in any country in the history of the world as has happened here. It's happening here. And I think it raised the question, is it going to work? I mean, there's a question of whether it's good for the environment and so on to have the population go up so much, but is it going to work? You can ask, as a matter of fact, you can ask the other countries, the ones that are sending immigrants, how do they feel about immigration to themselves? I've done this. We call them up and ask them. It's a very enlightening experience. By and large, I mean, the Japanese, for example, drop the phone laughing. Immigrants to Japan? Absurd. They don't even keep the numbers on it. Don't even keep the numbers on it. It's not possible to immigrate to Japan if you're not Japanese. It's extremely difficult if you want to go to Mexico. To emigrate to Mexico, you've actually got to go to Mexico City and apply in person at the Mexican, the appropriate ministry. That's why there's practically no legal immigration into Mexico. Now, of course, you may say people don't really want to go to third world countries because they're relatively poor. But of course, Mexico is very wealthy by the standards of Latin America. And furthermore, it's in these third world countries that the greatest return to skills. That's why we see large numbers of young Americans now going to Eastern Europe, because they have the skills to make money in that environment. There's absolutely no reciprocity in this area between America and the rest of the world. And that's equally true, incidentally, for the 14th Amendment. Very few countries have birthright citizenship. I'm sorry. I'm just thinking how to cut all this short. I have the disadvantage of going last here, so there's a lot of things I'd like to say. It seems to me that the fundamental, well, let's just talk briefly about the economic debate. This is the one I really want to focus on. You know, there are very complex arguments about whether or not immigrants are taking more out of the system than they're putting into it. I think, on balance, it's clear that they are. For example, the 1990 census numbers. There's tremendous cohort effect with immigration, incidentally. A lot of the stuff you've heard tonight is based on figures from immigration that occurred 20 years ago. You have to look at the most recent numbers to figure out what's actually happening. And the 1990 census numbers show that immigrants, on the whole, foreign-born, on the whole, do participate more in welfare than the native-born. And that's a particularly interesting number because the native-born is highly skewed. The number for native-born is highly skewed because it includes blacks and Puerto Ricans who are disproportionate into welfare. I might say, by the way, that one of the most extraordinary groups that's involved in welfare is the Soviet immigrants. They have 16% of them involved in welfare, as opposed to about 7% for the national average. Which is absolutely extraordinary considering they're the most educated group. The reason, of course, is that as refugees, they are eligible for welfare right from the start. Anyway, the fundamental issue with that, I don't like this argument because it's essentially a minute argument. I mean, whichever way you look at it, the amount of expenditures on immigrants is not all that large in the context of a $5 or $6 trillion dollar economy. The question is, it's not whether immigration is actually hurting the country, but is it necessary to have immigration? And if you ask this question, you find a very different picture. Because nobody, no economist, seriously argues that immigration is necessary for the economy. I mean, look at the example of Japan. It's grown at a rate, since 1955, it's grown at a rate 3 times as fast as Americans overall. And why is this? Well, the reason is what economists call the factors of production are at least threefold. They're not just twofold. It's not just capital and labor, immigrants being labor. It's a third factor, an intangible factor. There's a great deal of literature on this in applied economics, and they've never been able to show that increases in capital and labor together are worth as much as 50% of economic growth. There's some other factor that's providing most of it. And Japanese, that factor is technological change, innovation, and that's what the Japanese have done. There's another way of looking at the contribution of immigration, by the way, and that's in applied economics, there's a thing called a Harburger triangle, which is a way of looking at flows to one group from another from certain kinds of public policies. Now, the Harburger approach to, now this incidentally has been pioneered by a Cuban immigrant called George Borjas, an economist at the University of California in San Diego, whose work I strongly recommend to you on this subject. If you do a Harburger calculation for the benefits from immigration, it's very, very small. It's a fraction of 1% of GNP. I mean, it's not surprising, really. For one thing, there aren't that many immigrants in the country. There are about 9% of the labor force. And secondly, we know that the labor force is relatively insignificant in its contribution to economic growth. As a matter of fact, it probably always was in this country. I mean, it's quite wrong to imagine, as I think some of the people do here that have spoken tonight, that immigration is a constant to American history. As there was virtually no immigration from the Revolution until the 1840s. Again, of course, there was virtually no immigration between the 1920s and 1960s. But even between that, there were tremendous waves. It came in tremendous waves, followed by great pauses. And those pauses, incidentally, I think were crucial for assimilation. The standard work on the subject, the economics of the late 19th century, makes the point that per capita growth in the US was not significantly improved by the flow of immigration. Per capita growth per head of the population. Even people in favor of immigration haven't been able to argue that it was worth more than 4 or 5 years of economic growth. All immigration from 1790 to 1920 was worth maybe somewhere between 5 and 18 years of growth in the capital stock. It's insignificant. Highly significant to immigrants themselves, of course, but not very significant to the Americans who were here at the start. You know, we are under a misapprehension about immigration, which I know just denied. Immigrants are not that important. The U.S., they're important, but they're not terribly important. The population of the U.S. would have been about half what it is now if there had been no immigration after 1790 at all. And they had economic growth very substantially underway by the 1850s. I mean, they really had achieved a substantial takeoff. Anyway, so the conclusion is, you can't make an economic case for immigration. You can't show that it's necessary for economic growth. You have to make a political case. Now, there are many people here who are willing to make that political case. Some of them want to see their own ethnic groups increase in power. Others of them are concerned for moral reasons and so on. And there's a whole slew of arguments which I've not gotten into, but nevertheless, you can't make an economic case. However, although there are people who make this political case, who are in favor of immigration for political reasons, the fact is that the vast majority of American people, over a course of more than 30 years, have been overwhelmingly opposed to it by factors of 4 and 5 to 1. This is the deeply interesting thing about Alfredo's magazine. He prints here the survey of what Hispanics think about immigration. 84% of non-US citizen Mexicans are against immigration. Of course, they're the ones who face the competition from the new immigrants, so it's hardly surprising. But even the wealthiest group, the Cuban Americans, US citizens, Cuban Americans, 66% against immigration, further immigration, 34% in favor of it. Now, when you have a public opinion that's so firm on this question, or so massively on one side, so unyielding for more than 30 years, and a political elite which is dedicated to raising immigration, increasing immigration, as it did starting in 1965 and did again in 1990, this ultimately raises questions about the legitimacy of the system as a whole. And on that encouraging thought, I think I'll leave you. Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much. And now, as I mentioned, we're extremely interested in what you think. And, you know, I invite you now to pose questions to any of the panelists. Please keep your questions brief and to the point and state a question. Yes, sir.
Yes, Raul Perez from California, a third-year student at the Harvard Law School. Question, is the denial of health coverage to young illegal immigrants equivalent to the denial of public education, therefore constitutionally suspect? And are any members of Congress protesting the president's decision not to include illegal immigrants in any kind of form of universal health coverage, or is it political suicide in today's climate to advocate for additional services? So I guess for the legal question for Ms. Hernandez and the political one for the congressman.
Your question about the constitutionality of denying benefits to legal immigrants, you have, let me tell you that up till very recently, the mid-70s, immigrants were not entitled to benefits. The granting of benefits, Social Security benefits, is a recent phenomenon. The other thing that you must keep in mind, and you are referring to Doe v. Plyler, that was a decision that was a 4-5 decision. Of all of the Supreme Court justices of the 5, I believe we have 1 left. It is questionable whether, in fact, the Supreme Court today would rule the same way. The Supreme Court has indicated that it is permissible to make distinction based on citizenship and legal status. It is an issue that, of course, for the next 10 to 15 years, immigration and immigration status is seen as the next frontier on the development of constitutional civil rights within the Supreme Court.
And I try to quickly answer the second part of that. The President's plan, healthcare plan, does not deprive legal immigrants of healthcare benefits. Only the undocumented would not be included within the overall plan. They would have access to emergency services and some public health services through the President's plan. In terms of education, as Antonia just finished saying, there is no constitutional right for those who are not citizens to an education. Most of the rights, in fact, to education are state rights through the state constitutions and not through the U.S. Constitution. And of course, the U.S. Constitution speaks in no way whatsoever of any fundamental right to health care. And that's, of course, why we have 39 million people in this country who at some point or another do not have health insurance. But in terms of the issue right now, it's clearly a political issue. I see immigrants as the Willie Hortons of 1994. And what you find is that it's very easy to assail someone who doesn't vote and someone who doesn't make large political contributions and try to deprive them of certain benefits. Legal, not just undocumented immigrants, because it's very simple to go after that crowd and find some money when it's very difficult these days to find money whatsoever to pay for any type of program. So politically, the issue right now is where can we find the money? And a lot of folks are turning to immigrants at this stage, even legal immigrants. And there are proposals, for example, on the Republican side in the House to deny any type of public benefit whatsoever to legal immigrants, even though they pay every single tax that you and I as citizens pay, and they have every obligation that you and I as citizens have, up to and including going to war. Yes, sir.
I'm Tom Woods. I'm a student at the college. I've noticed sort of a little bit of a contradiction in a lot of what the panelists have said, which is on the one hand, the United States is the land of the free, home of the brave, land of opportunity. Immigrants want to come here. We want to let them in. It's a great country. On the other hand, it's peopled by a bunch of bigoted nativists who want to keep the immigrants out. It seems that you either have one or the other. Now, what I want to ask about, though, is I think also a lot of the panelists seem to think that are just mystified at the opposition to immigration. I mean, who on earth could have, I mean, why do these ignorant whites basically oppose it? I mean, what is their problem? They need to be re-educated or something. So what I guess I'd like to do is, Mr. Brimelow, I guess I'd like to drag him in further. He hasn't been controversial enough for his quota. So now, Mr. Brimelow, for those of you who don't know, wrote an extremely lengthy, but interesting, extremely lengthy article
Extremely interesting. Oh.
Yes, article in National Review about a year and a half ago on immigration. Very long. But you did emphasize in there, though, that there is a cultural angle to all this. Sort of, it's part of the whole multicultural debate. So I wonder if you might comment on that, and then hear if any of the other panelists have anything to say in response to that.
We have at Forbes a columnist called Tom Sowell who hangs out at the Hoover Institute. He's an economist, and he's one of about 3 black conservatives in the entire country. And he's done a lot of work on ethnicity and economics. And he makes the point that people do not enter, they don't reach maturity as a total blank slate, They carry what he calls a message, a cultural message. And this has profoundly important effects on how well they succeed in the workplace. And that's why he's able to document that certain types of immigrants do better than other immigrants. And they do it everywhere, not just in the US, but in other countries that they go to. It's not true, of course, not just true. They don't carry a message in terms of their economic abilities, but in terms of their political interests and so on. And so, the point is that, sure, if you introduce large numbers of very diverse people into the country, there is a question at what point the country is still the country, whether it becomes a foreign country. And it's a real issue. It's a logical possibility that we can see the U.S. transformed. In fact, and you catch them in the right mood. A lot of these people who are in favor of immigration and so on actually celebrate the fact that it's going to transform the U.S. And the U.S. is going to become a bilingual society and so on and so forth. As I say, the really intriguing thing here is A, the vast majority of Americans oppose this, and B, it's all the result of public policy. It's not something that's happened naturally. I'm not close enough to the door to get more controversial than that. Thanks very much.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Terry Gerstein, and I'm a second-year law student. And my question is based on some of your comments about the legal immigration going on now. And I was wondering if any of you advocated changes in the legal systems right now, the legal ways of people immigrating to the country, meaning asylum and the quota system, and if any of you advocated an opening, a greater opening of immigration law in that respect.
I can tell you that I don't think we need to either reduce or increase the level of legal immigration that's coming into this country. With regard to asylum and refugees, the issue of refugees, what we find right now is a dilemma. We are clogging the system. We have over 300,000 asylum claims that we cannot process because we don't have the people we need to do so. And as a result, we are letting a lot of folks who are claiming asylum out, and we are not detaining them. And as a result, you get the fears of people carrying bombs and coming to this country to commit crimes. What we need to do is shore up the system so that we can unclog the backlog and let the system flow so that we continue to allow people who have legitimate claims for asylum to go through, those who are legitimate refugees to come through, and we're able to get those who have frivolous claims. So I don't think you have to change the system a whole lot except try to streamline it so that you can process it quicker. We have to devote more people to it. We perhaps put in about not even 1/10, probably about 1/20th of the resources into asylum that, say, the country like Sweden or even England does into the system of asylum. So if we do that, we take care of that. In terms of the immigration that comes in across our borders, mostly the southern border, I think what we have to do is realize that we will never stop people from coming in, either crossing the borders or coming in with a visitor or tourist visa and overstaying. People will always come. It's more a matter of how can you try to prevent the flow from increasing. And I think we can do a much better job of trying to patrol the border, perhaps put a more aggressive force there, aggressive in terms of numbers, not in terms of violations of civil rights, and try to apprehend people before they cross over. Once they're in, it's very difficult, and it also violates constitutional protections to try to apprehend people in many cases.
Yes. Yes, my name is Ted Parris. I'm a first year here at the Kennedy School. This question is for Mr. Rimlow, and then for anybody else who might want to respond also to it. What was interesting to me about the portion that you gave was that you kind of shaped the issue by asking the question, is immigration necessary for economic growth? And it struck me, one, because I didn't think anybody else who spoke before you claimed that it did, and in fact we're saying that I would acknowledge the fact that immigrants are a relatively small portion of a 270 million population, and thus the question of their contribution to economic growth relative to that of technology was, and it seemed to me as a non-issue. Thus, I asked the question, given that immigration exists and given that so many people, well, okay, I'll acknowledge that many people in the United States are against it, but given that it exists and it's happening, well, then the question becomes, why not? And not, well, why so? You understand my question?
Well, I do, Ted, but I guess I basically don't see the point. It's up to the Americans to choose how many immigrants they want. And you have to make a case for it. I don't agree with you that people didn't imply here that immigration was good for economic growth. It seemed to me that's exactly what Muzaffar was saying. He was talking about the Chinese, what was it, laundries or something, restaurants?
No, they improved things.
Right. I mean, it's a standard argument that's used to justify immigration.
That it's
particularly for capitalists.
I think that it's positive is one argument, but that it is necessary for economic growth, which you pose as a question I don't think people are making. That is essential for economic growth. Thus, to phrase and say, well, is it necessary? And thus, since it is not, eliminate it. It strikes me as, well, why? Why eliminate it unless it's...
I want to emphasize that you have to want this immigration on political grounds. You have to make a case for it on political grounds. You can't make a case on economic grounds. It's not wise to. You simply can't show that it's necessary for economic growth. You have to absolutely positive, as it says in the Federal Express, as want to transform America.
I just want to add one thing. But I would normally resist this temptation, but since I'm at Harvard, I won't. It's answering Mr. Brimlow's question: is immigration necessary or no? I don't know if those of you know Harvard's distinguished economics professor John Kenneth Galbraith wrote a very interesting book called The Nature of Mass Poverty, in which he actually points at the declining economic stature of England and says that England lost its auto industry because England was insisting on making cars with Englishmen. And that's exactly is good part of the foundation of whether immigration is necessary. It doesn't mean that people who are already there are not capable of engaging a lot of economic activity. It is that when you do bring new energy, new enterprise, and new education, it does spur the economy in a way which has been very, very productive for the U.S. and for other countries of the world which have opened their doors to immigration.
I mean, the numbers.
And Japan is an example that Mr. Brimlow pointed out, will tell you that the Japanese growth did reach a stage for about 20 years, and now people are questioning strongly whether Japan can keep its level of economic growth with its doors shut to immigrants. Very potent question in Japan today.
I just can't believe that Galbraith would say anything as silly as that, even Galbraith, because of course it's precisely when Britain went into its economic decline that they started to have the first mass immigration for nearly 1,000 years from India and the new Commonwealth.
Let me see if I can jump in real quickly as well. I don't think it makes any difference if we think it's necessary or not. It's going to happen. Immigration will go on, migration will happen throughout the world. Some of the migration will end up coming to the U.S. We have to realize that we cannot erect walls that will keep people from coming in. We can try to control our borders as best possible, and then we can try to figure out what the effects are of the immigration that has come in, hopefully more regulated than not. But the fact remains that the immigrant that has come in cannot be denied the fruits of his or her labor. We would not have railroads stretching across this country if it were not for the Chinese immigrant. We would not have the major cities that we have on the East Coast if it weren't for the Polish, Jew, the Greek, the Italian immigrants that came in. We would not be eating cheap fruit, very inexpensive fruit. We would not be able to... You and I would be paying probably double the price for the garments that we wear at this stage were it not for the labor of immigrants. So for people to deny that immigrants provide a benefit to this country, to me, is absurd. Now, whether or not you can actually come out with a balance sheet that says, on the whole, how much they contribute or how much do they consume, that's much more difficult. But clearly, the signs are out there. You can step out this door and look at the person who's cleaning the streets, probably, and find out that we are benefiting tremendously.
Let me add a little controversy to this, because I think that we really need to get to the heart of the issue. One is the economic issue. You can argue either which way. And in fact, the reality is that immigration issue and the debate will be formulated based on politics, based on emotion, and not based on economics. And that is what we're dealing with today. And I believe, because I can get you an equal number of reports on the economic benefit or detriment, more basically on the benefit. And I would say that, this country, as we all know it, thrived on the backs of immigrants. We are a country of immigrants. We're not like England. We're not like Japan. This is a unique democracy, a unique country. And the debate today is about culture. And let me frame it to you as it was framed to me by a congressperson, a congressman. As we were discussing immigration, he said, Antonia, I'm worried about the changing complexion of the country. And he goes, oops, I guess it was really literal, okay? That's what we're debating today. Whether the immigrant of today, whether it be the Polish, the Armenian, the Korean, the Mexican, the Salvadorian, whether that immigrant meets the stereotype, the image of what we perceive an American to be. And I believe that as individuals involved in this debate, we've got to hit straight on the issue and debate it on those merits. Otherwise, we're talking in code words, and we're not going to make any points talking in code words.
And to respond to a point raised by one of the earlier questions, I don't think it's surprising at all that there is this type of opposition to immigration, and I don't think there's any point in being righteous about it. I think it's very understandable. People are very concerned with demographic change. It's something that produces a tremendous amount of anxiety when you look around and the very complexion of your neighborhood is changing very, very quickly. That's very, very understandable. And it's something that I think that emotion we need to understand to debate this in an intelligent fashion. Yes, sir.
My name is Dennis Lopez, and I'm a second-year doctoral student in the Graduate School of Education here. And principal concern is that of something that Congressman Becerra brought up, and that is the protection of human rights of the undocumented immigrant along the border. I grew up in San Diego, California, and there, as a U.S. citizen, as an American, and as a Chicano, I observed many times very basic human rights being trampled upon, not only by private individuals, but also by police and immigration and naturalization. I think Mr. Rimelo brings up, interestingly, the racial implications of immigration policy, perhaps not explicitly, but certainly he brings that up implicitly. As a Chicano, as an American, I find that the Immigration and Naturalization Service does a very poor job of being able to distinguish and in their enforcement practices, and basically terrorizes the Chicano Latino community in the Southwest. And finally, I just wanted to comment, I don't know if the quote was accurate of the Hispanic magazine and the 84% of, I have to tell you I find that if 84% of Latinos are against immigration, that is absolutely amazing to me. Being a Chicano, growing up in the Southwest, it's as if I was somewhere else, but certainly where I'm from, there are not 84% of Chicanos and Latinos against immigration.
Dennis, make sure you understand. The question was, do you oppose undocumented immigration, people coming in without documents or without legal status? I think you're going to find almost to a person that people would say, yes, I oppose that, because we should. We are a sovereign nation. We have a right to say how people can enter into our country. But ask individuals how they feel about the immigrants who are here, if they are here to work or get on welfare, and they will tell you in vast majorities that they are here to work. If you ask the Latinos in California if they support undocumented immigration, they will tell you no in a majority. But ask them now if they agree with Governor Wilson that the child who is born in this country to undocumented parents should be deprived of citizenship status because he or she is a child of the undocumented, they'll say no. You have to distinguish, and that's what we're trying to say. And Antonia's point is well taken.
Congressman, the question was actually, are there too many immigrants?
Let me ask you this: Is Europe, with 360 million people, with about the same landmass as we have, overpopulated? Should we abolish or annihilate 80 million people who live there? 80 more million people than live in the U.S.?
If I might add, Zoe Baird might have answered that question. No, there should not be undocumented immigration, and yet she employed the undocumented. Agribusiness employs the undocumented. The textiles employ the undocumented. So again, I think these questions, the way they're phrased, is very important. But what I'm trying to convey is the fact that the undocumented immigrant is an integral part of this economy. They're an integral part of this culture. They're an integral part of the Chicano Latino community and of the broader community, particularly but not exclusively in the Southwest. And I think as we set up this polarization of those against and in favor, we really run into a lot of risk of the gray area. Again, the Zoe Baird example I think is a good one. Yes, I oppose undocumented immigration, but I have employed.
That's why I said at the beginning, I hope what we do is distinguish between immigration policy and the issue of immigrants.
We're running out of time. We've got time for two very quick questions. Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Randy Parras. I'm an MPA 2. During this discussion, there's some sort of separation between the politics of immigration and the economics of it. In my sense of reading over the literature and talking to other people who actually studied labor markets, they said the majority of the flow of immigrants is market-driven. And we've talked about the push from other countries. We haven't talked about the pull from the United States for, to bring in immigrant labor force. I mean, our history, we've gotten so bad, we actually go to other continents and force people to work here, i.e. slavery, in order to pick, cotton. And so my question is, to what degree, to all the panelists, to what degree or to what percentage is the flow of immigrants market-driven? In other words, it's hard for me to imagine that people are just coming here and there's no, they don't employ themselves, they don't have the capital, they can't get the revenue, the loans. Obviously someone is employing them.
Can I just respond to that from trade union perspective? I think that's really an important point to be made, is that you can't have a decent debate on immigration unless you look both at the pull factors and the push factors. It's not just the poverty of the sending countries that is responsible for migration. unless people had jobs to come to for which there was a demand, people would just not move. And we have in this country, as all capitalist economies have, we generate certain kinds of jobs which the economists call the secondary sector of the economy, which are characterized by harsh discipline, by low wages, by very unsafe conditions, very low upward mobility. We've had that throughout in our economies. Now, each country, I would submit to you, defines its own secondary sector. If you look at a sanitation worker job in New York, even if you are third generation American, you're black, you may not get it. There's no way an immigrant would get a sanitation work job in New York because we have defined it to be a high-paid job. But if you look at a sanitation job in Germany, you won't find a German interested in that job because we have made it a dirty, low-paid job in Germany. We have our own secondary sectors of economy. Our apparel industry is a very important component of that. We have, and this is, of course, part of the debate we could not get into, that immigration gets linked into, Antonio talked about foreign policy and other, it gets extremely linked to trade policies. We have, in the last 20 years, proactively abandoned good part of the manufacturing industry in the country and sent those jobs away. Now, if you have any part of a US manufacturer staying in New York and competing against a company in Hong Kong or a company in Venezuela, you have no choice but to pay the lowest wages possible. And therefore, if you depress the wage to a level, there's obviously those jobs are jobs in which US workers are not interested. And then you create the vacuum, and that's when the immigrant, including the undocumented, get attracted to that. So if you really have to have a rational approach towards plugging that vacuum, you really have to improve jobs in this country. Then you will get US workers interested in them, and you will see the pull factor then be plugged, and immigration have certain semblance of control.
Can I comment on that? Mazava has a problem, really, because from an economic standpoint, the rational thing to do with his members' jobs would be to send them to Latin America and do all the manufacturing of this type of low-skilled work offshore. And that's how the Japanese have gotten around this alleged labor shortage. By and large, they've tended to export the lower-skilled jobs. And conversely, there is another form of incentive which hasn't been mentioned, or at least only skirted around tonight, and that's a big difference between this wave of immigration, the previous great wave from 1890 to 1920, and that is the existence of the welfare state and very heavily subsidized public education actually going up to the graduation from high school. If you look at the numbers, you'll see that about a third, more than a third, nearly 40% of the immigrants who came here from 1890 to 1920 went back home, primarily because they failed in the workforce. They went back home to go back to the farms because they just couldn't make it in the US. Now that's no longer happening. Net immigration is very high now. And I think that one of the factors behind that has to be the fact that if you fail in the workforce now, there is this safety net in which the immigrants, in fact, are participating quite heavily.
Kim, if I could just real quickly, I think the best evidence of the pull factor causing people to also come, not just the push factor, is the governor of the state of California. The same gentleman who is now indicting immigrants is the same gentleman who, when he was then U.S. Senator Pete Wilson in 1986, did everything he could to make sure that the agribusiness industry in California had access to cheap immigrant labor to pick the crops in the fields. He did everything he could. He did nothing else in the realm of immigration except that, and he succeeded. And now, 8 years later, of course, he's condemning those same individuals who are in the state for having been in the state when he was, in fact, the person who helped create that pull factor and the jobs that were taken by these immigrants.
One last question.
Yes, my name is Andres Orlando. I'm a senior at the college. It seems to me that what we're hearing is one side of the debate saying that immigration is in fact good for the economy, and then the other side saying immigration isn't necessary for the growth of the economy. But I haven't heard anyone say that immigration is bad for the economy or laid out the reasons why it's bad. And so my question is, please, what are the reasons? And beyond this idea that somehow our democracy is at risk culturally with a changing polity, with a new immigrant, because I mean, history belies that argument. That was the same thing said in the 1890s when immigrants came in the Great Wave. And I think it's actually a tribute to our democracy that we have continued so strongly with such a diverse group of people. So my question is, what are the detrimental effects of immigration on our economy, not how much do they contribute to the economy.
I have a feeling that nobody else wants to answer that question. Is that right? 25% of all inhabitants of federal prisons are aliens. The alien-born population in the country at large is 9%. In other words, one of the effects of immigration has been to increase certain types of crime. This is true for all waves of immigration. All of the great crime waves in American history have coincided with massive numbers of immigrants, partly because they tend to be young men, and young men are disproportionately inclined towards crime. But that's just one area. Now, I can hear a lot of muttering in the audience at this point, but, you know, it amazes me when I listen to this debate. I hang around with the people who worry about immigration, and they think they're oppressed. They think they're not allowed to discuss half the issues that they want to discuss. They think the issue that there isn't this great, that the public debate is entirely controlled by the other side. And one of the reasons for that is that everybody is terrified of being called a racist. And that's why I appreciate Antonio's comments, because in last night that is an important question. What color do you want the country to be? Is there a reason for it to change it? Now, another reason, economic reason, I can go on about this endlessly. In fact, I have 73,000 words in my book, in my bag here on this. Another reason why you have to worry about immigration is what the congressman just said. He's quite right that the benefits of immigration from a tax point of view flow to the federal government, and the cost fall on the local government. In order to get around that, there has to be massive transfers from the federal government to the local governments. And that means the federal government's going to have to tax more. So it's going to move the U.S. towards being a more high-tax economy, which I happen to think, I mean, is the reason why Europe is relatively stagnant as compared to the U.S. It's high tax rates. So in other words, immigration is going to force the politicians, which they want to do anyway, raise taxes. That's another factor.
Let me give a little response and also tell you that...
Are you responding to the question, Antonio, or to me?
To both. To both. Let me respond as far as facts and numbers. A lot has been said about the percentage of quote-unquote aliens in the penal system that quote-unquote are undocumented. Facts are, and they're from the census, 1990 census that you will get, is that the statistics that are being quoted are taken from the Spanish surname individuals in the penal system. If you segregate those numbers specifically, the number of undocumented individuals in the penal system, and most of them, as you probably know, is in the federal penal system, because if their immigration status comes to bear, they are notified and sent to the penal system, is under 10%. And one of the problems with our census is that it is extremely difficult to discern if you have a name like Hernandez, whether you are a citizen, whether you are a resident, or whether you are undocumented. As far as the economic issues, let's go to the issue of cost, and that's one that was made that is true. A large percentage of the taxes that are paid by, let's talk about the undocumented, goes to the federal government. The people live in localities and in places like California and Texas. And because of the money is not sent back and distributed, there is an increased cost to the localities, to the cities, and to the counties, specifically in the area of public health hospitals, because a lot of these individuals do not have insurance and go to the emergency of the hospital, which is the costliest way to get health benefits. Also into the public schools, because of the children going to the schools there. So when you talk about the cost to the cities, to the counties, and to the state, it is localized, and the transfers of money are not made to where those costs are incurred. And in fact, that's one of the issues that the state of Florida has sued the federal government. In California, Javier knows very well the pressure from the state, the county supervisors, and the mayors trying to get the federal government to offset some of those costs. So it's the allocation of the taxes and where they're going, and that's where the burden is at the local level.
I need to respond to. I'm glad Antonio clarified the issue of the criminal alien, because not only is it true that we go only by Spanish surname and decide that the person is undocumented, But at the same time, we don't distinguish between an alien who is here legally, commits a crime, and then is sent to the federal penitentiary, and between one who is here without documents and is sent to the federal penitentiary. We don't identify those individuals. We don't segregate. And as a result, all we can talk about are those who have either Spanish surnames, or we can talk about those who are foreign born. We can detect who are foreign born. But there are a lot of folks who are U.S. citizens who are foreign born. And those folks get lumped in, and that's where you hear these numbers of 25% or whatever else it might be. They are inflated, or they are at the least, they are misperceptions of what is reality. But we'll never quite know, because there's no way to really count them unless we were to go into the prisons and do so. On the issue of taxes, though, and this perhaps could be a drawback of immigration, but it's not a drawback because the immigrant brings with him or her the negative. It's because our governments are unwilling, for political reasons, to deal with the issue of immigration. If the federal government is collecting more in taxes than it should, and is distributing those monies to communities that don't call themselves home to those immigrants, then the federal government is distributing monies in an inequitable fashion based on the taxpayers, including the immigrants, who are providing the money to the Treasury. The federal government will not deal with it, though, because it means my being able to get a vote from a member of Congress in Idaho or Wisconsin or New Hampshire, because that dollar doesn't belong there, and it should go to the communities, say, in Los Angeles or Texas or New York or New Jersey. But try to get a dollar out of a member of Congress, either for immigration, education, healthcare, it makes no difference. There are 435 fiefdoms in Congress on the House side, and there are 100 fiefdoms on the Senate side, and no one gives up a cent. So what we have to understand is the problem we have is that the federal government is unwilling to fess up to its responsibility in that regard. Drawbacks to immigration? I'd say the underground economy, which does not benefit the Treasury as readily as it should, that's created by a lot of immigrants, documented and undocumented. And it's not just immigrants, of course, who are in the underground economy. There are a lot of folks, citizens, who are trying to take advantage of an underground economy. But to the degree that we cannot collect the benefits, tax benefits of the underground economy, we all suffer some. The avoidance of the governing system. People who are immigrants, legal or not, oftentimes don't use the governmental agencies because they're either afraid to, they don't know how to. And in the cases of public safety, health, I think there could be a drawback to the community if, in fact, there's something going on that we should know about. But in terms of the economics, I must tell you that I do think, on the whole, that there is a net contribution by immigrants, not a consumption by immigrants. It's hard to prove. You can find studies and statistics that say one thing or the other, but I think on the whole, you would find that economically, immigrants do provide much more than they ever take.
Okay. Absolutely the last question.
Yes. This question is for Mr. Brimelow, and I'd like to hear the argument against immigration based on values and politics without any economics in it, because earlier you told us that, that was a closed matter and it was not an issue, and somehow we spent half an hour, 40 minutes around the economic circle again, and if you could factor it out, it would inform the debate, I believe.
Ultimately, the U.S. is going to have to decide, the American people are going to have to decide whether they want to be what they were in 1965, which was predominantly a European country, which had certain traditions which were very deeply rooted here, and which had a very clear and stable ethnic balance. But that ethnic balance had been stable for well over 100 years. Or whether it's going to become a different kind of country. Whether we're going to see areas of the U.S. which are predominantly Hispanic, Spanish-speaking, or whether we're going to see areas which are Asian, where the relationship between Asian and whites, which is a very different society than if it's between whites and blacks. I think fundamentally it comes down to a question of the union. Do you think the union is going to be preserved, or do you think that diversity actually means divisiveness? It used to be very popular at one stage to go on about, we've forgotten this now, about unity is strength and all this stuff. The motto on this great seal, E pluribus unum, the vice president translated this wrongly recently. He said what it actually means is out of one, many. And that's really the issue. I mean, is that what's going to happen?
Paul?
So you'd say that it's what color do you want the face of America to be kind of issue?
Do you mean literally?
literally, you've said.
That's one issue, yeah, sure. I mean, that's determined by public policy right now.
Well, that's where I think the true issue lies, is the complexion. I think historically the minority, the people that look different, are a scapegoat, are a reason for the problem. The Japanese, we suffered it too, Japanese Americans. My father lost his business and everything because he was taken into a camp. And he went to Stanford and he was about ready to start his business. I think the Bracero program started up because of the need during the war to have labor. So that was okay then. But once the economy changes, well then, hey, it's not okay anymore. And they're a threat. They're changing. They're different, so maybe we should keep them there. I think ultimately they are used as political pawns, and I just feel that maybe that's maybe the true root of a lot of our discussion tonight.
And I'd like to say that I really thank Peter because we are having an honest debate on what's on the minds of a lot of people. And in order to have that honest debate, we have to put it in those terms. And I think that as we speak on this issue, it is not an issue of whether you're racist or not. It's a value system that we have to debate about how we perceive this country to be. And I will tell you that I am involved in immigration debates ad nauseum. And I am really grateful to you, Peter, for putting it on the table as clearly it is and for us debating it that way. And I do think that folks in the audience need to appreciate the way it's been debated tonight and Peter's perspective, and for us to be able to debate it on those terms in a rational manner. And for that, I do thank you, Peter.
Do you think I'll get my return ticket?
I think one of the benefits of being a moderator of this type of discussion is you get to have the last word. And like a good lawyer, after making all the reasoned arguments, you like to finish with an emotional appeal. I like to say that I myself am an immigrant, and many of the people on this panel are either immigrants or the children of immigrants. And something that I believe very, very deeply, and many of the panelists may agree, is that my life and our lives in many ways embody the American dream. The American dream, a promise of endless horizons, of unlimited opportunities, was invented by immigrants. That's what the American dream is all about. And in times of great change, when we look to ourselves for some sort of renewal, the place where we'll find it is in this American dream, which is brought to us by immigrants coming from across the world. Every day to our shores. That's what I think is important to bring out of this. Certainly, if not for immigrants, you wouldn't have Hispanic Magazine. And I'd like to add, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Brimlow, you wouldn't have Forbes Magazine either, which is started by an immigrant.
2 or 3 generations back.
I want to thank all of you.
That's why the publishers are Forbes.
The original founder was an immigrant, correct? Point well taken. I want to thank all of you very much for joining us here tonight. We appreciate it. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
At least they understand your accent.
Peter, you got to send me your book.
Thanks. Do you have a card left?
That was funny.